Hi, in this video we are going to look at the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is the ninth cranial nerve. And then we are going to look at the 10, 11, and 12 cranial nerve as well. So here we start with the ninth cranial nerve, and imagine that this is the nerve, and then look at the different fibers and the nuclei which receives these fibers or send out these fibers. So here we start with the sensory nuclei of fibers. So here is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal system or nucleus, and it will receive the fibers from the auricle, and the sensation from the auricle will be received by this nucleus, like the pain, touch, and temperature. So these fibers are incoming fibers. They are sensory. And we'll look at another nucleus, the nucleus of tractus solitarius. It receives the sensation from the different part of the mouth or the oral cavity, like the soft palate, the tongue, the tonsils, and the areas, associated areas of the pharynx. From the tongue, from the 1/3 of the tongue, the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, the different sensation will go through to the nucleus tractus solitarius, and as well from the carotid sinus, right? So the sensation from these areas as a sensory sensation will go through the ninth cranial nerve to reach the nucleus of tractus solitarius and supply the lower part of this nucleus. And then there is another nucleus, which is the parasympathetic nucleus and called the inferior salivary nucleus. If we draw here inferior salivary nucleus, and the fibers from the inferior salivary nucleus are parasympathetic fibers, it will go out, so it's outgoing fibers as a tympanic nerve when it leaves the ninth cranial nerve and go to the tympanic plexus, and then the otic ganglion here, and from otic ganglion it will go supply the parotid gland. So here we write the parotid gland. Now we look at the fibers and different nuclei, and I will show the course of the glossopharyngeal nerve as well. So here is the main motor nucleus of the ninth cranial nerve, which is called the nucleus ambiguus. And from here, the motor fiber will go supply the muscle, which is called the stylopharyngeus muscle. So here we write the stylopharyngeus muscle. And there's one thing, the taste fibers. Now, from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, the taste fibers will go through the ninth cranial nerve to supply the upper part of the nucleus tractus solitarius. Now, we look at the section of medulla and show all those nuclei that we just have learned, and then show the different fibers and the different structures that they supply. So here we draw the section of the medulla, and here is the fourth ventricle. This is the fourth ventricle, and we divide the medulla into left and right. Here is the inferior peduncle, the pyramid. Okay, so we put the nuclei, and here is the nucleus, which is the dorsal nucleus of vagus. And then here is the nucleus tractus solitarius. So this is the nucleus tractus solitarius, and here's the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal system. And then we have the inferior salivary nucleus, which is the parasympathetic. And here is the main motor nucleus of the ninth cranial nerve, called the nucleus ambiguus. So here are the different nuclei in the medulla. And when these nuclei, they give the different fibers, like the sensory fibers, the motor fibers, and the parasympathetic fibers, and all together will exit through the brainstem between the inferior peduncle and the olive. So they make up a nerve called the ninth cranial nerve, or the glossopharyngeal nerve. So here are the fibers, the sensory fibers and the taste fibers, and here is the parasympathetic fibers making up this ninth cranial nerve, and the motor fibers. Now we draw all the structures that they supply. So we start with the hard palate, okay? So this is the nerve, and if we look at the hard palate and we draw and imagine that this is the bony structure of the hard palate. So here we go. Here is the hard palate, and behind it, it has the soft palate. So this is the soft palate, and it has, in the mouth, we have the tonsils, right? So here is a tonsil, and then we have the tongue. Here is the tongue, okay? And then we have a muscle. This is the stylopharyngeus muscle. So we just imagine that this muscle is the stylopharyngeus muscle. And then we have the carotid sinus in the common carotid artery. So here we draw the internal, external common carotid artery with the carotid sinus, right? And then we look at the middle ear. If we draw the middle ear, and the medial wall of the middle ear has a promontory in which it has the tympanic plexus. So here is the oval window in the middle wall of the middle ear. And here is the promontory, oval window, and here is the promontory here. And then we'll look at, and then we make the middle ear here. And here is the tympanic membrane and the external auditory meatus, auricle, and the milius, the incus and stapes, which are the ossicular bones in the middle ear, right? And here we draw the floor of the middle ear. And here is the parotid gland. So the parotid gland is just beneath the auricle, right? Here is the parotid gland, and here is the tympanic plexus, okay? So we start with the auricle, and the sensation from the auricle will be taken by the 9th cranial nerve, and it will be supplied to the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal system, right? And then the sensation from the soft palate, from the tonsil, from the soft palate, from the tonsil, and from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, the sensation will go to the nucleus tractus solitarius, as well as the sensation from the carotid sinus, right? And then the taste sensation from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue will go to the upper part of the nucleus tractus solitarius, right? Through the 9th cranial nerve. And then there is the inferior salivary nucleus sending the fiber as the tympanic nerve, go to the tympanic plexus here, and from there as a lesser petrosal nerve will go to the otic ganglion and then supply the parotid gland. And then we have the last one, the motor fibers. The motor fibers will go to this muscle, the stylopharyngeus muscle. So this is all about the glossopharyngeus nerve. Now we look at the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve has the different fibers like the glossopharyngeal nerve. And here we imagine this is the 10th cranial nerve. And it receives the sensation from the auricle, which are the sensory sensation like pain and touch and other, and will come to the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal system. These are the sensory nuclei and receiving the sensory fibers or the sensation. The different visceral sensation is received by the nucleus of tractus solitarius from the lower part, right? And then the taste sensation from the posterior most of the tongue is believed to be received by the upper part of the nucleus of tractus solitarius through the vagus nerve. And then we have another nucleus. This is the dorsal nucleus of vagus, which is the parasympathetic system and sends the parasympathetic fiber to the different viscera, and where they stimulate the different involuntary muscles in these viscera. So here, involuntary muscles. And if we write here these viscera like the bronchi, right? The muscles of the bronchi, the heart, the esophagus, the stomach, the small and large intestine until 1/3 of the transverse colon. So the muscles of all these viscera, the involuntary muscles, are supplied through the vagus nerve by the parasympathetic system. Now we look at the main motor nucleus of the vagus nerve, which is the nucleus ambiguus, and it sends out the fibers through the vagus nerve and supply the muscles. So if we show here the muscles, and they are the constrictor muscles of pharynx and the intrinsic muscles of larynx. So this is the vagus nerve, the different fiber it has, the sensory, the parasympathetic, the motor, and the different nuclei. So now we look at another nerve, which is the accessory nerve, and it has two parts, or the nuclei giving the fiber, which are, it has like the cranial part and the spinal part. So from the medulla, the nucleus will give the fiber, which is the cranial part of the accessory nerve, and in the spinal cord, like the C1 to 4 or 5, the different segment will give the fiber, and which is the spinal part. And the spinal and the cranial part together will make the accessory nerve, and this nerve will supply the muscles in the neck, which is called the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and it will also supply another muscle which is called the trapezius muscle. And now we look at the hypoglossal nerve, the 12th cranial nerve, and it has a nuclei here near the 4th ventricle, and it will come out to supply the styloglossal muscle, the styloglossus muscle, the hypoglossus muscle, and the genioglossus muscles. So this is all about the fibers and the nuclei of the 9, 10, and 11 cranial nerves.